you can't believe a word that Putin says now and ever, okay? And if I were advising anybody, except you, Rick, then I would say, let's concentrate on the threats today, okay? The threat of Russia taking over Ukraine and holding its territory, that's a threat today. The threat of China against Taiwan, that's a threat today. The threat of terrorism. So to me, one of the real, points I would make is talk about current threats rather than these airy-fairy, someday I'd like to kind of things from Putin, who is totally unreliable.
There is a new space race on the way, only this time it's about turning space potentially into a battlefield. This is because President Putin has vocally expressed interest in developing nuclear space weapons to send into orbit. It would force the US to develop and deploy their own counter weapons into space too. Well, joining me now is Kenneth Lee Adelman, the former US ambassador to the UN and former director of the US Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, who was an advisor to President Ronald Reagan during the superpower summits between Reagan and the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. Kenneth, good evening.
Good evening, Rick. Thank you for calling.
Oh, it's really good to have you on. Absolutely fascinating. Now, can we just dig down a little bit into this story, this idea of a new space race? What exactly is it being proposed that the Russians would put into space in order to shoot down Western satellites?
It's all rather fuzzy at this point, Rick, but I get a chuckle out of this, although it's not a very chuckable topic, because I was with President Ronald Reagan in Reykjavik, Iceland, during his October 1986 summit with Mikhail Gorbachev.
Yeah.
And Gorbachev went crazy about SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, that he accused Reagan of putting nuclear weapons in space, but our program of SDIs, Strategic Defense Initiative, did not have any nuclear component to it. And he just went wacko about it. Overall, can't believe a word that Putin says now and ever, okay? And if I were advising anybody, except you, Rick, then I would say, let's concentrate on the threats today, okay? The threat of Russia taking over Ukraine and holding its territory, that's a threat today. The threat of China against Taiwan, that's a threat today. The threat of terrorism. So to me, one of the real, points I would make is talk about current threats rather than these airy-fairy, someday I'd like to kind of things from Putin, who is totally unreliable. He has used the nuclear card in Ukraine, I think, all too effectively to scare off President Biden and discourage him from giving the kind of heavy armaments that we should have given right after the February 22nd invasion.
But I suppose we also need to ease people's fears when we hear about the word nuclear and the word space, because the background to this seems to be that it would be a nuclear-powered spaceship, not a nuclear weapon. And this seems to have all come about because of how the Ukrainians are using satellites in some form provided by Elon Musk's system to target Russian forces in Ukraine. So it does actually come down to helping traditional warfare in Ukraine, it seems.
That is true, Rick. The fact is, it's not just the Ukrainians who are using satellites in a very important way, but all of us are using satellites in a very important way. And what we tried to do in the Reagan administration, and I think American administrations and the British government since that time, has been, let's keep outer space demilitarized, okay? Let's not have anti-satellite weapons in space. Let's not have threats to our satellites, because we depend on them for GPS, we depend on them for directions, we depend on them for military communications, for command and control. We depend on them for enormous things. So that threat, Rick, is a real threat today. So I I would put that into an anti-satellite weapon. Now, whether they're nuclear or nuclear powered someday in the future, these things take years and years and years to develop. So I don't see this as a particularly frightful event right now.
Do you think that space in some ways is one area that actually has been successful in being kept a neutral place when it comes to war going on Earth? I mean, the reason I mentioned that is something I spoke to a guy called Pavel Podvig about, the Russian physicist. When the fact we've got an international space station, and despite a war going on in Ukraine, which is backed by the US and the UK military, that there is still cooperation in space when it comes to the International Space Station with US and Russian astronauts working at the space station. It's one area that remains safe, an untouched space in some way.
It's not untouched, Rick, but it has been pretty nicely demilitarized. So your point is a good one. I remember testifying in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee in 1983 about the threat of militarizing space. Okay, and people were worried about it in 1983. That was a long time ago. Okay, and the point was made. It's working fine now. It's we have it basically demilitarized in terms of offensive weapons and even defensive weapons. In terms of military utility, it's very important because of communications, command and control. What we rely on space is awfully important for our national security. But it has not been because of weapons or defense. It's because of communications.
Kenneth, thank you so much for your time tonight. Thanks for speaking to us.
Well, okay, thank you for calling.
Kenneth Lee Adelman there, former US ambassador to the UN, former director of the US Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, worked with President Reagan, speaking to us there about the threat of a new space race on the way. Well, let's talk a little bit more about this, because earlier on I actually spoke with Pavel Podvig. He's a Russian physicist. He's director for the Russian Nuclear Forces Research Project. He's also a senior researcher in the Weapons of Mass Destruction program at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. So we wanted to speak to him on his take on what Putin's trying to do here. And he told me what a Russian space race might look like.
It's difficult to say. We don't have all the details, but we know, and it's been known for some time, including in the open literature, that Russia has been developing a range of anti-satellite weapons, and some of them are kinetic, as the one that was tested in 2021. But this is not it. So this, what we're looking at here, it appears that this is some kind of electronic warfare weapon that is supposed to jam satellites or do something of that kind. So that is the best guess of the community that is looking at these things.
And would the purpose of this be linked to what's going on in Ukraine? Because we know, don't we, that the Ukrainians been very effective when it comes to use of Elon Musk's Starlink satellite network. So could it be an intention of the Russians to try and take out part or all of that satellite network to help their ground forces in their assault in Ukraine?
I don't think this is linked to the war in Ukraine directly, because these programs take a while to develop and to put together. But more importantly, if we are looking at the system like Starlink satellite, we should keep in mind that this is Starlink includes more than 1,000 satellites. I don't know the number, but this is a very distributed system. So it is extremely difficult to actually disrupt its operations. I mean, you could do a little bit, but to totally shut it down, I think it's nearly impossible.
I mean, space really is, it's a new frontier, isn't it, when it comes to military technology? And I suppose we've actually been able to see, though, through what's gone on in Ukraine as they've used satellites, and artificial intelligence so effectively to attack Russia, how important the use of space technology can be.
Well, I think that it's fair to say that space technology is important and the space capabilities are important. But at the same time, we can see, and Starlink in this case is a very good example of a system that is very difficult to disrupt. I mean, if you could think about it this way: if there is a system, space-based system that provides some military capability, then it is almost certainly very difficult to take down. Like, for example, Starlink is one example. Another example is the GPS satellites. For example, you could these are about 30 satellites. So it's extremely difficult to target that system in a way that would disrupt that capability that it provides. So I think that this is I've been skeptical about this whole anti-satellite business precisely because of that. Because if you have a system that you really want to rely on, then you would make sure that it is distributed. So loss of one satellite or a few satellites will not really deprive you of that capability.
The U.S. administration, U.S. politicians seem to be pretty concerned about this, and they've used the term nuclear firepower in space. Now, just to the average man or woman, what exactly does that mean? Nuclear firepower in space. What's the nuclear element of it?
It's hard to tell exactly. I think again, as people have been looking at the bits and pieces of information that's been released, I think the consensus that is forming in the expert community is that it is possible that this is some kind of a nuclear-powered spacecraft. Which means that it may have, as we understand that there is nothing on orbit right now. It's a program. So it's a program for a satellite that may have a nuclear reactor on board.
I see.
That would provide it with it would be a source of energy.
Okay. And so that's rather different to kind of nuclear strikes, which I imagine is what comes to many people's minds when they're listening to this. So it's the power of the spacecraft. It is generated by nuclear energy. So I suppose some of the headlines here are slightly misleading, aren't they? So it's the power of the spacecraft. It's generated by nuclear power, but the intention seems to be that it will strike down other countries' satellites in the Earth's orbit for Russia's gain.
Yes, I think you could think of it this way. So if we're talking about the kind of entire spacecraft capabilities, so you could think of a powerful jammer, for example, that would disrupt the communication. So for that jammer to be powerful, you need a lot of power, and a nuclear reactor is one way of doing that.
I think the big takeaway from that is we don't have to worry too much yet. Pavel Podvig there, the Russian physicist and director for the Russian Nuclear Forces Project. What a guest. Speaking to me a little bit earlier about this potential new space race. Above the earth, of course, but this is after President Putin has vocally expressed interest in developing nuclear space weapons to send into orbit. But we are not to panic, according to Kenneth Lee Adelman and Pavel Podvig, speaking to me a little bit earlier on.